forward to this panel for a whole day because we have amazing partners and friends from the most respectful VCs in this space to share their investment thesis on the themes that related to our event today. So I'll give the panelists a moment to introduce themselves. Yeah. Michael?
Yeah, hey everyone, my name is Michael, investment analyst at 1KX. Started with the team about a year ago, mainly focused on DeFi and crypto social, and particularly interested in like VCs and decentralized identities. So super excited to get started and chat with you guys.
Hey everyone, Carl from Shima Capital. Shima Capital is a VC, early stage crypto VC from the US. I'm the CTO and investment partner. Yeah.
Hey, Cam from Z Prime. I guess I'm the head of portfolio. Yeah, great to be here.
All right, welcome. Then I'll just start the first question. So I'm actually curious about like how you guys gonna interpret like the social individual we mentioned today a lot. Yeah, so like what it can bring to people and yeah, any interesting or exciting things we are going to see. And it would be better like if you can share some your investments that related to this theme. Yeah, who wanna go first?
Yeah, sure. So in terms of like the ideal self-sovereign economy, I think there's like four main aspects. The first one would be ownership and control of your own data. So we see in Web2, entities are profiting off of your own data. So I think the hope is that with on-chain data, you'll be able to dictate where your data goes, but also be able to monetize off of that. The second aspect would be access to financial and social rails without having to give up super sensitive information. I think in Web2 it's very binary, where either you sign up with a bank account and you have to give up all your information, or you're not able to participate at all. So the hope is that with some sort of ZK proof system, you're able to prove that you're a worthy individual and still be able to access a bunch of the rails. The third aspect would be like granular optionality. So I think that, for example, if you have a punk and you want to be a part of like a Discord, you could attest that you have a punk, and it could be like any punk. But you can also attest that you have an alien punk, which naturally implies that you have millions of dollars worth of NFTs. So I think providing that optionality and giving the option to users to decide like how sensitive the information they provide, I think is really important. And then last but not least is just like general knowledge of the implications of privacy. I think that in Web2, like a lot of users don't really care. We saw that with like TikTok and Facebook and all the data breaches there, and there wasn't really a shift in behavior. So I think the hope is that users will care a lot more in the future.
So I'm curious, like you were mentioning, like maybe it will change the current financial patterns, right? So, because I think currently we see more the use cases still on-chain. So do you think like we will see like it will soon maybe change the like Web2 patterns?
Yeah, I think on-chain credit scoring is a super tricky space. One of the biggest problems is like if you get a credit score based on historical behavior on-chain, the first thing is that it doesn't actually dictate your future behavior, and also it can be easily gamified. So I think without recourse in the real world, it's really hard to create like a sustainable and scalable system. So I do think in the future there will be like ZK NFTs based on the fact that you KYC'd on a specific exchange, or you have a certain amount of collateral off-chain. I think the blend between off-chain and on-chain will get a lot bigger in the coming years.
Interesting. Kyle, would you share your comments?
Yeah, so for us, we usually look at this holistically, right? So when we make investments, a lot of times there's a lot of trendy things coming out of this entire ecosystem, right? But for those of you that were around back in 2009, we must remember why Bitcoin was created, right? So essentially, when it comes to self-sovereign economy, it's where the value capture happens, right? So for example, the market is always shifting towards a much more efficient state, regardless of what's happening in the macro environment, right? So that translates to that any project is helping with the value capture for the user, right? So a good example is if you think about LinkedIn, it's a really good example, is what you do is you upload your resume and ultimately you get a job, right? So to a lot of people, it's pretty good value capture, right? But if you truly think about this is, I think LinkedIn was acquired for like, what, $20 billion, right? So is that value capture really going towards the users, right? I don't think so, and therefore, and that translates to blockchain, right? So the entire thesis of this whole ecosystem is that we will make this market a lot more efficient by shifting the value capture to the end users, right? So that also translates to your identity, you own your identity, you own the data, right? Which is not happening very fast today because generally you're not owning your data truly, right? And of course, at the end of the day, you also own the monetary value of your digital assets. So that is actually the most developed out of the other two. So the investment thesis would be, hey, what are the mechanisms for us to better own our identity and data? So between the two, I think DID is a little bit ahead, and the data ownership, most folks are not aware of like its value. So those are areas we're looking at.
Cool. Ken?
Yeah, I guess the way I think about it is maybe going back to like what is the self-sovereign economy, and I kind of think about it in two parts. The first part is like obviously meritocracy, which is naturally, enabling people to be self-sovereign. And then I think the second part is accessibility. And when we kind of tie that together with maybe the core use cases of ZK technology, which kind of come down to three things in my mind. There's like privacy, information compression, and outsource verifiable computation. And on the privacy front, that obviously helps with meritocracy. I don't think I need to repeat it, but anything along the DID attestations, that really goes a long way in terms of abstracting away any preconceptions we might have of authority, whether it's like your favorite Twitter influencer is the one who posted the opinion as opposed to, someone anonymous. I think someone on Lens was building something like this, which is pretty interesting. But then, obviously the scalability side is also very important, and that's just in terms of getting the technology in the hands of as many people as possible, and enabling them to participate in DeFi, et cetera, whether that's exposure to US dollars for people from, sanctioned regimes that maybe need an outlet from, an oppressive government or whatever it is. And so I think, those two pieces are really what enable the self-sovereign economy.
Since you guys already mentioned zero-knowledge proofs, and Kyle also mentioned there are some trendy words in this industry, I believe like zero-knowledge proof is definitely one of the best words recently. So it just reminds me of the blockchain plus everything era in 2017 to 2018. Yeah, so I'm curious, do you think there's also a bubble in ZKP investments? How mature and ready is this technology actually currently?
I wouldn't necessarily frame it as a bubble. I think the best way to look at it is like the Gartner hype cycle chart, where there's initially a lot of hype and then it kind of dies down and then increases over time. I guess relating to the blockchain and everything thesis, back in the day there was like all these ICOs such as like Beehive token for like decentralized Airbnb and things like that. But we're actually starting to see a lot of these narratives play out, which is super cool, right? So bringing real-world assets on chain. There was like a company recently that got funded to build decentralized Uber. So I think, yes, there's a lot of hype back in 2018, but as that kind of died down, builders continued to work on their projects, and now we're really starting to see like real-world adoption, which is really cool. And that applies as well to zero-knowledge proofs. Like definitely not as used as much right now, but it's a matter of when and not if.
Cool. And I wanted I just curious because LinkX is the seed investor, seed round investor in ZK Sync, right? So our co-host today. So would you like to share a bit about like the stories behind this investment, because you guys got in quite early, right? Before like zero knowledge proof is well known to everyone in this industry.
Yeah, so for context, we invested in ZK Sync back in 2019, and all props to my partners for kind of thinking about that trend very early on. But yeah, we were actually like hosting ZK summits in Berlin when there was only like 10 people who were showing up. So I guess like the underlying thesis there is that zero knowledge proofs play a pivotal role in terms of information compression, as Cam was mentioning. So that's kind of like how we saw it back in 2018, and it's great to see the progress in the past few years.
All right, it's just 10 people at that time. Now it's really hard to get a ticket to the summit.
I think the most recent event had a few hundred, but before there was under 10 actually.
I see. Cool. What about Kyle? What's your opinion?
Yeah, so I have a story. Like, so I used to work in space, wrote code for NASA, and then send some spacecraft to space, right? And there was a really good mental model, right? So you have the people that are actually sending the spacecraft to space, and you have the people that are living in the cloud that are giving out thesis to tell you how to build a spacecraft, right? So the best spacecraft is always a paper spacecraft because it's perfect on paper, right? It will never work in real world and so forth. So I think that's what's happening today with ZKP is you have a lot of good theories, but at the end of the day, ZKP is a means to an end, right? It's not the end. So what we're seeing is a lot of noises being produced because everyone's so excited about the technology. And I don't think that's a bubble, because without the people in the cloud, we will never send real spacecraft to the space, right? So I think it's a process in which we are going from, hey, we're so excited about this, to a more mature phase where you're actually developing real applications from these technologies, right? Another good example is like DeFi. DeFi was really hot, super exciting. Everyone's talking about this curve, that curve, which curve is better, the slippage and so forth, right? We don't hear about DeFi. People think DeFi is dead. I disagree, because DeFi is going from the application layer to the infrastructure layer, right? So for example, you're doing gaming, well, guess what? You can't have gaming good tokenomics without the underlying DeFi being there to support the trading, the facilitation of some of the features, right? So I don't think it's a bubble, but more like a process in which we become a more mature ecosystem.
Cool. Carl, since you have very solid tech background, could you please guide us about like what actually zero knowledge proof can do or cannot do?
Yeah, I think Cam had a really good point, right? Scalability is one way to apply the technology, and privacy as well. So we usually, when these things get really hot and popular, people try to use these terms to and use these type of technology to apply to everything. I personally don't believe that we need to use ZKP for everything, right? So just have to stay very careful and cautious from an investment perspective. Is okay, what is ZKP doing here? And because there's real trade-offs, complexity, right, as well as the speed in which it costs a lot of time to compute and so forth. Also, there's a lack of developer toolings around that technology. So I think if we take this technology and we kind of look at it and see, okay, if it's applied to scalability, such as layer 2, roll-ups, and so forth, then it makes sense. But it doesn't always make sense with the newer projects that's coming out. So that's kind of where I stand.
Awesome. Cam, it's your turn.
I think that basically sums it up. You kind of, I guess, have this issue for ZK, which kind of goes back to when people first started talking about it, however long, like 2015. And I think the big issue was people were really early to spot the potential for ZKP, but obviously the practical implementation of that takes a really long time. I mean, even the like newest proof systems that, you know, people start getting really excited about, whether it's like Nova or like Plonky 2, like these are really recent. Like I think we take that for granted a lot, and so when it comes to, you know, implementing this into, you know, actual projects that deliver the scalability or the privacy, it's we're still early.
All right. And then I'm curious, like, what are the narratives or so-called zero-knowledge proof application that you guys think are currently overrated? Yeah, I'll start with Cam this time.
Great. I get to address the spicy question early. I think the application for scalability is obviously like really important, and we can see it's like a really good use case of this, of ZKPs and the kind of information compression quality of them. But I do think, you know, maybe on the roll-up side of things, there's a lot of really big valuations and a lot to be proven in terms of, I guess, value capture and returning that value back. I think, you know, a lot of high-level mental models were informed by simply the valuations of layer ones, which might not necessarily translate as well. Yeah, I think some early examples of this are like basically the Polygon team revamping the Matic tokenomics as an example. And so, you know, I think maybe there it's something to keep an eye on.
So overrated is a very unique and interesting word. I don't think anything's overrated if you can apply it well. So then going back to what I was just talking about is, well, is it practical to apply this technology to this application, right? Generally speaking, I think it also ties back to decentralization, right? Not everything needs to be decentralized. I don't care if my to-do list is on a decentralized server or like a centralized server. So at the end of the day, we really have to look at what is the application, right? Is there a need for privacy, or is there a need for scalability? Because if you think about layer 2 rollup, why ZK is used is because there's a constraint on the layer, underlying layer 1, right? You're not able to publish all the data. You're not able to translate all the data from layer 2 to layer 1, otherwise the fee is too much. And also it's a security concern as well. So that definitely makes sense. But generally speaking, if you're looking at a project and we're saying, okay, we need to make this this streaming service decentralized, sure, but we're adding ZKP in the middle for whatever reason, I don't think it makes a lot of sense, right? So I just generally, like, how do you apply the technology versus just how, like, generally, like, oh yeah, this project's overrated or that project's overrated, so.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you guys as well. I think overrated is a tough word to use, and maybe a better way of framing it is like, what are some use cases of ZK technology that already exist that could see more adoption and more experimentation? They kind of talked a little bit more about the high-level thoughts, but maybe like more specifically, there's already a few applications that you can already use today. One example is governance. So there's a lot of controversial votes that happen quite a bit, and one way of creating privacy is having like ZK proofs that represent a specific token position, and then you're able to vote based on that ZK proof or NFT, and basically remain anonymous. And so another example would be if you're in like a sub-DAO and you only had 5 people in the DAO, and you need to vote on who to get promoted. Potentially these voters don't want to reveal what their action or vote actually was. So that's like another application where you could apply this technology. It's tough to say right now, like what's overrated, what's not. I think we're at the very early stages of this adoption, and it would honestly be great to see just like more experimentation in general.
Cool. This ZK governance is really sounds interesting. Yeah. So curious, like, are there any other use cases of zero-knowledge proofs that you'd like to share with us? Like, is ZKP currently an investment theme or a major investment theme for your fund?
Yeah, in terms of other use cases, I'm actually quite interested in the intersection between ZK proofs and social. So, for example, like, it's quite specific, but what if you had Pokemon Go, but then everyone was like grouped in a team, and then there would be a feed based on the actions that you took within the game, and then you could produce like a zero-knowledge proof that says someone from this team did something at this time. So it's like a different way of presenting information, and I think that could be like really interesting. But at the end of the day, like another use case would be aggregation. So I think this is something interesting like Sysmo is doing, where you can basically aggregate a bunch of things about different wallets that you own. So if you have like 3 different wallets, then you can just make one NFT that says, hey, I own 3 different punks across 3 different wallets. So I think aggregation is super interesting. But I guess for 1KX, we see the core technology as more of like a feature rather than a product. And then there'll be like super interesting products that will be built like on top of this tech.
You took all mine. I'm just kidding.
So what about
So interoperability, and I think it's relatively new, but generally speaking, the bridges today are a lot better than the ones that was created, say 2020, 2019, but it's still not good enough, in my opinion. There are various issues with the bridges today, right? The form of bridges that we see today are somewhat still centralized, a lot of these, even though they are somewhat decentralized, but in my opinion, it's not decentralized enough, but also more importantly, the problem with the security, right? So the bridges are, in my opinion, the issue with the security issue with the bridges are actually far more complex than building a layer 1, because first, you have Byzantine issues with these bridges if the messages are not passed, right? And 2, real value is being transferred, tons of these values. And I have this thesis is that a lot of institutions are not getting onboarded because of these bridging issues, right? So with ZKP, we can solve a lot of these issues in the sense that, if you can prove the Merkle tree mutation of the original chain using ZKP, and you're able to prove that on the other side, you don't need a committee-based consensus to kind of mechanize this whole transition and bridging, right? So in that regards, you will be able to prove that something indeed happened without like having like a vote or having multiple parties to kind of decide that really happened. So I'm super excited about ZKP application in the interoperability domain.
Interesting. Do you believe that ZK bridge, like this, like bridge using the zero-knowledge proof, will be the end game for bridges?
So I generally think it's problematic still because the Merkle tree mutation proof is only applicable to blockchain-based blockchain, meaning like one block after another block type of architecture, right? It's much more difficult to be compatible with DAG-based. And I think that some of the newer blockchains are using that technology, and inherently that's difficult. I am very bullish on such technology, but it will take time, right? Perhaps we roll that out for blockchain-based ecosystem, and then we go from there, because I think that's strictly safer than say, hey, you have a oracle, and then you also have like a relayer, and you verify the proof. But there's going to be tons of optimization needed, because verifying these proof are generally a lot more expensive. So,
Ken, do you have anything to add?
No, maybe not really. Maybe just to tie it back to, self-sovereign economy. I do think there's a really interesting application, which I suppose is along the lines of attestation, but more along the idea of like radical meritocracy through solving problems on chain and basically posting, the ZK proof of the solution without having to reveal your solution. And so you can kind of get to a point where, like, if the problem is on chain, that anyone can kind of come and prove themselves and prove that they can do something incredible. And so when you extrapolate that to, you know, much more important problems for like humanity where you can get to this, you know, it's a really interesting way of not having it along, you know, maybe more rent-seeking channels like top-tier university research tracks, etc. And so I think that's a pretty interesting kind of angle that one of our portfolio companies, Topology, is doing things along that vein.
Topology, they're building on StackNet?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting one. Yeah, okay. And another topic I want to touch upon this is privacy, because recently we've seen several cases that we've seen like regulation is getting in the way. So do you think zero-knowledge proof will be a way out? Or it could just arouse more, you know, attention from the regulators?
I don't think ZKP is the solution for such a problem. I think decentralization is. If you think about this, is that without decentralization, you're able to be taken down a lot easier, right? So I more so think of like decentralization is the foundational piece that you must have, and then with ZKP, you can add on privacy on top, though we generally get confused with decentralization, right? Like, you know, if you think about decentralization, it's a multi-dimensional effort. You need to decentralize the code, you need to decentralize the governance, because if you don't, then they can take down that centralized governance and you lose your capability, right? You need to decentralize your hardware, hosting environment, people, processes, and I would argue, like today, we're putting code into GitHub. It has been proven that that is not a good way to go about decentralization, right? And if you want to drill down to the nitty-gritty details, is like, well, what about the developer that's pushing that button to deploy the official version for this the decentralized software, right? Which might be a blockchain or application. What if he goes rogue and now you lose everything if it go through the pipeline and everyone downloads it and then it gets infected? So really decentralization is a very difficult problem to kind of think about, because today we're only thinking about, yeah, how many nodes are you running, how many nodes is the foundation running, but what about everything else, right? Because when you're faced with regulatory issues, you're not only looking at it the single-dimensional things, such as, hey, like 20% of your nodes is outside the US, 80% is. You have a real issue with like the hosting problem, right? Even if you're hosted outside the US, if you're on AWS, Google Cloud, you will still be in trouble, right? At that point, Ali Cloud doesn't sound like too bad of a choice, but realistically, I don't think ZKP will solve that problem, but it definitely helps, because once you're sufficiently decentralized, you can add on the privacy layer, right? So.
I really like this statement, but it seems unfortunately there are still a lot of components today of Web3 still like centralized, so it seems maybe still a long way to go to achieve the final decentralization.
I think the human race is generally lazy by default, and that's why engineers are the laziest out of all, because we're creating the freaking automations everywhere. There was this news article, this engineer wrote a script so that he could automate the coffee making from when he left his chair till he got there, right? So I think there needs to be external force to kind of force us to go through decentralization, because unless it's necessary to decentralize, why even decentralize, right? So I would argue like the regulatory issues that we're having today is actually good for the ecosystem in the long run, right? So yeah, it's just a matter of time. So the stronger the external force is, the faster we evolve, right? It took us like, what, 10, 15 years to go to the moon, and then we never did it again because we have no reason to, right? So that's kind of where my mind is today.
Michael, do you have anything to share?
Yeah, I guess from a regulatory perspective, I think with every new technology, there's always this pushback from regulators. One recent example is in Myanmar, they recently are trying to like cut off all ties to cash, and getting all citizens to issue their identity to like a bank, and then obviously there's this surveillance system where they're in control. And then from our side, we're trying to push for like extreme privacy. There's solutions like Alio and Aztec that are trying to create private banking systems. And I think at the end of the day, regulation also is a good thing, I agree. And then hopefully in the long run, the optimistic route would just be that you're able to use this technology to preserve privacy.
Yeah, it's a tough one. I think the answer is kinda, which is not great, but the reality is not necessarily a comfortable subject to talk about in the crypto world, but like regulation is coming, and probably more than any given individual would like. I think DID helps a bit in terms of maintaining, you know, a level of pseudo-privacy, but you know, you've seen it with something like on the extreme end of the spectrum with like Monero, and in some countries it's illegal to own Monero, right? And you know, I think we just have to be you know, moderate in our expectations.
Okay, awesome. And my last question is something like not related to ZKP, finally. Yeah, so I just curious, like any other like interesting new directions that you guys are paying attention to? Because Kyle already mentioned something about data, right? So did you see any like trends or potential opportunities there from data sector?
I think it's super early. If you ask the average person, maybe even crypto community, is how important is your data ownership, right? It's unclear whether people will say yes or no regarding how important it is. But my prediction and my anticipation is assuming the underlying technology is worked out, meaning you have decentralized storage, highly scalable, you have somewhat decentralized compute that is able to retrieve real-world data into these compute environment, which is not smart contract today, right? The most important the most important, the most valuable piece out of that ecosystem is the ability to truly and wholly own your data, right? So data ownership ties back to LinkedIn. Like imagine you upload a resume and you own your data, so any recruiter that tries to contact you doesn't purchase a freaking, what is that thing called?
LinkedIn Premium?
Yeah, I hate that, but that's the thing you buy, right? Instead, they pay you. So essentially, the market needs to shift towards a more efficient state, which translates to cutting out the middleman more and more with the minimum fee. So like the optimal setup will be direct transactional relationship with minimal fees paid, and you cannot achieve such level without true data ownership. So I think that is probably one of the most important thesis at Shima. I think it's very early because you know I love protocol labs, I love Filecoin, IPFS, Arweave, and so forth, but we're just not quite there, right? And also decentralized compute, we're looking at it. It's still too early, I believe. But once we get these pieces figured out, we should see a massive adoption of data ownership, and I think that will be super, super exciting.
What kind of the signals that you mentioned, like we have these pieces there and then we will,
Yeah, that's really easy. When people stop talking about it, then it's more mature, and then we can start thinking about the next piece, right? So if you see a technology that's consistently mentioned in the news, then it's not ready. Similar to DeFi, right? Like less and less people talk about DeFi. It's not because it's dead, it's becoming more and more mature. So that's how I look at it.
Interesting. What about Michael?
Yeah, in terms of other processes that could help empower a self-sovereign economy, I think one of the interesting things that I read this year was Vitalik's paper on decentralized societies, more specifically on verified credentials. For example, if I went to Harvard and I wanted to get like an NFT that proved that I went there, there's still this centralized power of like the dean's office at Harvard that could censor this issuance. So what Vitalik is proposing is that we take more of a bottoms-up approach rather than a top-down one. So the specific example would be, instead of me getting a graduation letter from the dean's office themselves, it would be a community of students and professors and workers within a DAO that come together and automate this process for me. So for example, like if I graduated in 2017, I would need to have a minimum threshold of approval from people inside the DAO. And this is like really important because then there's no censorship involved, but also you can use things like quant-based discounting correlated scores, right? So you need to have a specific type of person, such as like a person from class of 2017, N18, N19, all vouch that you went to the specific school. And there's other things such as social recovery or burning and reissuing that I think are super interesting. But in general, like I hope that the issuance part of VCs and NDIDs will come from bottoms-up approaches rather than top-down.
Interesting. Ken?
So non-ZK. I think right now I'm really interested in UX improvements and I guess things more on the consumer side. I think, we've gotten to a point where we have a decent amount of infrastructure where, if you're really trying, you can decentralize your whole stack as an application. So the next kind of question is, what's driving demand? And I think right now, the fact that, you can do stuff on mainnet for like 3 cents, 30 cents, it's like a pretty good indicator that demand is extremely low. And yes, it's the bear market and everything, but I do think crypto's been putting off the demand side of the equation and the mass adoption for a long time. And so we need to, find the drivers and use cases that'll bring that kind of consumption of these infrastructure resources. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Do you guys have any other interesting fun stuff to share? If not, then I'll just wrap up this panel. All right. Thank you guys. Thanks for the insightful ideas, opinions here. All right, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for joining. Thanks all.